How's it going, YouTube? Coming to today with another video, and today, guys, what the video is going to be the Where to Handtrap series update. This is going to be really important because today we're going to be dipping into variants. Variances are really important because we don't really talk about it a whole lot, but your opponent's hand isn't always going to be the exact line that you're used to, where you're like, oh, this hand trap goes here. Sometimes their hands are really weird and they open different, and then you have to kind of adjust on the fly. So we're going to be talking about that with a few different decks today, and I do hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you haven't already checked out my sponsors over on RW, Cloud, Gem, Arla, Imperium, Dragonshield, or Grimoire, definitely go ahead and do so, all down below in the description. Also, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for more content like this. Let me know that you enjoyed the video by liking the video, and again, subscribing to the channel. We're aiming for 30,000. It's going to be amazing once we get there, and I love meeting each and every one of you at events. It's been an absolute blast, and I can't wait to hop right on into this video as well to talk a little bit more about variants. So, Maliss, this is just how you hand trap the deck. But on a real note, a lot of the Maliss players right now are cutting thrust from the main deck, and we haven't really seen too much of the side deck even having thrust as well, so that's where Chaos Hunter is becoming a huge problem, and that's one thing that I could see Maliss players going back to, is playing thrust so they can go into talent, steal a Chaos Hunter, and keep playing. There's a couple different ways that you can go about it, but I do think that the Hunter and the Lancia right now are pretty solid for the sideboard. Impulse and Phantasm are both fantastic in this matchup. Usually you have to high roll this deck, and it's very much so a game 1 deck because you're just hoping you don't get Lancia'd or Huntered game 2 or 3. So you kind of have to high roll this deck now, and that's something that is changing quite a bit because you can just hold Ash for your opponent's White Binder's Revive, or you can just hold Ash for your turn and hit the MTP, which is fine. But a lot of times right now in particular, I'm just ashing the normal summon Chessy Cat effect, or if they lead a lore, I'm just going to go ahead and ash it. If your opponent normal summons Dormouse, even if they set a card, I'm just using Valor or Imperm. I just want to make sure that the high roll factor of this is just going to go ahead and negate their card. And then what's important about that too is you got to realize out of 40 cards, there's only 2 cards that they can draw to properly dodge that off of just setting a card. It has to be exactly MTP or TB11. Draw it, right? I'm just absolutely high rolling my opponent, throwing the Valor, because there's a lot of times where if they don't open field spell, they're just passing. And a lot of the newer lists right now are playing a ton of Bestials, so they won't exactly just pass right away, and you'll have to have Valor plus a hand trap, right? Usually even better is Valor plus Nibiru, because in this situation you would still Valor early and then Nibiru later, but it's still going to be as good. And it really does depend if they're playing Dotscaper or not. I still love the Dotscaper in the deck. I think that it's really strong. There are a lot of players that are taking it out and trying out a lot more the 2-card combos and playing a lot more Bestials, but it really will depend on when you want to Nibiru. I think that it's even more proper if you're playing the Dotscaper to just put your opponent in a position where you're you can drop it, but it won't matter, because you just don't banish the Chessy at all until you need to with the field spell, because you just go Ransom, and then you have the Chessy summon off the TB11, you bring back Dotscaper, and you look at your opponent and you're just are you gonna do it? And if they don't, then you just keep comboing. If they do, then you just go activate field spell, banish Chessy, summon Chessy, Chessy effect, banish, draw 2, combo anyway, right? So that's why I like Dotscaper. There are other ways to play around Nibiru, but cards like Abalakui also have to banish itself, so you can chain Nibiru to the effect of Abalakui as well, which is really nice to just get rid of it, and then the effect will resolve without effect. Same with Ogre. If you Ogre Abalakui, the same thing will happen, which is really solid. Also, if your opponent puts up a Griffin, you can also just throw Ogre. Griffin is less common now. It's still there, but the end boards are going to be a little different based on what build you're playing against. I think that the Fiendsmith variant is still around, but at the same time, it's usually just pure right now with Shifter in the main deck, so we'll have to wait and see how the format shapes up. I predict that it's going to be triple Droll and triple Shifter, triple Impulse in the main deck now, but we'll definitely have to wait and see what is going to be the more popular build. But I definitely like holding Bell for the White Binder Banish effect on board, and I don't really like hitting the GWC unless you're worried about life points. Then you can just Bell the GWC, But if your opponent has a Bestial, they banish the white binder, bring it back. Now they can banish 3 of anything they want. So especially with the increased number of Bestials right now, I'd rather just hit the binder effect on board to make sure that my graveyard is safe, or your opponent can't just banish 3 and summon 3, right? Even if your opponent has the Bestial, after you bell the white binder, they better have a link on board if they want to bring back the White Rabbit from a Bestial, because if they don't, then it doesn't really matter if they're even setting the MTP or not. But the big takeaway from this is going to be you have to high roll this deck, because the deck will absolutely full combo game 1, and it is the scariest game 1 deck. But the deck can brick, and a lot of times if you throw a Veiler at the Dormouse, and even if they have a card set, your opponent might just pass. Ryzeal Fiendsmith, not a whole lot's changed. You still throw every hand trap under the sun at duo drive, including Purge if you're playing it. That is a very strong card right now as well. It's like a second Ash, but it's only the effect that would add a card. It doesn't hit the card effect that would be Special Link from deck. But it's still very strong, because what isn't searching right now, you know? But negate the duo drive 100% of the time. You can bell the engraver. If you have a breaker that's not going to get rid of the body of a detonator, you can just go ahead and bell the eclipse, which is also fine. Bell is very lackluster in this matchup. It's not bad, but it's not like the best. And then Nibiru is going to be dropped right onto the engraver princess, because your opponent's going to be threatening the Caesar. But if you have Veiler Nib or Imperium Nib, you're going to be waiting until your opponent summons duo drive after the Caesar. They'll go duo drive effect to add. You'll go activate Nib, they'll chain Caesar, you'll chain Veiler Imperium onto the Caesar, and then your opponent will chain Emit Defeat. Now with the Bestials here, if you have Druid Swarm, you want to hit the Requiem, because this is going to stop your opponent from getting the loops on your turn, especially with the Paradise. But if you have Magnemite, you can go ahead and just hit the engraver on engraver effect, and then once you get the Druid Swarm in the end phase, you can just go ahead and Druid Swarm banish the Requiem. That way you get rid of both problems immediately, and you don't have to worry about any kind of looping. And at that point, you just get a ton of free value, especially with multiple bodies on board. Now, even in the Mitsurugi variant, you're still going to be hitting the duo drive, but there are going to be a couple more instances where you really want to pay attention to. You can impulse the prayers, because you do your effect on resolution, so it's not going to be decided at activation if you are going to be summoning or not, but you have the potential to. So you can impulse the whole card, which is nice. You can bell the card because it can summon from grave. This is one of the most important things to stop in the deck 100% of the time. But you do want to impulse the ritual, especially if they go activate ritual, summon from hand, because you know Ameno is coming out immediately, and you want to just drop impulse to make sure that that's not going to hit the board. Relatively also, you want to make sure that even if you're not going to be stopping the effect to add, you're still going to be able to Bestial away the Ameno from grave, because your opponent's usually going to use the prayer early on unless their hand's like crazy. So your opponent can't even chain like a prayer to bring back like the Ameno there. You're just going to go ahead and Bestial away the Ameno so they can't bring it back later on, and force them to get to their other one, which is going to be even better, because at that point you don't want this to be a reoccurring problem. If they get to Futso, I don't really feel like you care as much, but definitely keeping this one on board is going to be a problem, so get rid of it as soon as possible. Now the next one here is Blue Eyes. This is going to be very specific as to what lines you want to stop, because there's a few different ways your opponent can open. It's always going to be Ash or Purge onto the Wishes. This card is very good. It's an in-archetypal melody. We already are aware of how crazy it is when a melody resolves, but now this one is going to be getting a Speller Trap and a monster. It's very strong for what it is, so definitely make sure that you go ahead and stop the Wishes. I also really do like Droll Shifter or Phantasme in this matchup. Phantasme right onto the Link 1, be able to get into more hand traps or Bestials or things that you really want to see. Because let's say that your opponent does get to Spirit, they summon Spirit, and then they add the Mausoleum of White, activate Mausoleum, dump the Blue Eyes preemptively, because your opponent might not have a monster on board once they use the Spirit. Preemptively, you want to go ahead and just use a Bestial to go ahead and banish the Blue Eyes out of grave and force them to have the spell to bring it back from banished, or have an extender to bring it out from deck. But that being said, I really do like Ghost Ogre onto Mausoleum to stop the dump from deck to grave for the Blue Eyes. A lot of times your opponent's not going to be using that additional normal right away. It's going to be later on in the turn. So going ahead and stopping this immediately is really strong, because again, you don't want the Spirit to get full value by being able to bring back a Blue Eyes, to bring back the Maiden. So Ogre or even Typhoon, because your opponent usually will have something like a True Light up. So you want to make sure that you are going to go ahead here and stop the Mausoleum, because that card is going to allow your opponent to extend into multiple different plays here. Imperium or Valor right onto the Spirit is going to be where you want to be at. Not only are you going to be adding the Mausoleum, but you're also getting that free Reborn effect, so you want to make sure that you are on top of that. But also remember, this card does lock you into Dragon while it is on the board, so if your opponent does start summoning other things, make sure that you are calling them on that. Also, Valor Imperium could be really good onto the Primite Dragon, but your opponent will just go Spirit after anyway, so you want to make sure that you are just hitting the Spirit. It's going to be your best bet here. Also, onto Maiden of White. This is going to be really important. So, you either want to Bell, Bestial, or just Impulse the Maiden coming back to the board. Again, this is something where you want to make sure that you are stopping this card from coming back to get into the Synchro Spirit. But you also could go ahead and just Impulse the True Light if they try to bring out a monster. A lot of times they're just going to be setting. You do have the effect of the Synchro Spirit to go ahead and negate an effect in Graveyard, so if you do try to pop like their True Light, they can go ahead and just negate that, which is fine with the deck too, because they're like, okay, that didn't really matter too much, because of the fact that the main can just reactivate it from grave on the follow-up turn. But I feel like this is very similar to Voice's Voice, where you want to keep your opponent off of low. Maiden in this deck is effectively just low, so that's something where you want to make sure that you have some kind of stop or some kind of banish for the Maiden, so they can't go into the Spirit, which gets them into the Omni Negate. Next up here is going to be Mermail. Again, Droll, Shifter, Impulse. Cards are pretty reoccurring. You can see a theme, you know? These cards are very, very strong. They're going to be the most prime cards to use in the matchup. Bell is really mid in this matchup. You can hit the Anemone, but that's definitely up to you if you want to do that or not. That's definitely going to be something that's not super crazy, but it could be impactful. The actual impactful things you want to do here are going to be Ash Purge onto the Prima Donna or onto the Abyss Shrine. You can Ash the squad, which is fine. Hitting the Shadow Squad is really good, but the new combo is using the Prima Donna to summon out the Water Barrier statue. And that's something that we definitely do not want to see happen, because that is really broken when your deck does not contain waters, right? So that's something that you want to make sure that you are on top of. Make sure that you have a game plan for this, and stopping this in any way, shape, or form. Valor, Imperium, Purge, Ash, whatever you got. Stop the Prima Donna. Do not get Water Barrier statue locked. Hitting the Abyss Shrine here is really good too, because I have a question mark over on Coelacanth. The card itself can stop a Valor Imperium. If you have another fish on board, you contribute that other fish, but again, that's only if they have another fish. So I put a question mark there, because if they don't have a fish, Valor Imperium is very good. If they do have a fish, then you need like Valor or like Imperium Valor, right? But the other part of this too is that you could just Ash the Abyss Shrine at that point if you don't have a Valor Imperium and you're afraid of the Coelacanth, and your opponent isn't doing like a Prima Donna combo. So, in the standard build right now, we are seeing a lot more Prima Donna, which means a lot more Barrier Statue, and you want to stop that. But if you don't see the Donna hitting the board at all, or if you don't see the Gluttonous, the fish card that we saw at the YCS, then I would just go ahead and Ash the Abyss Shrine, because that's going to gain your opponent a lot more value. The last one here is your opponent will usually summon the Abyss Strike, the Atlantean Spirit, which is a very strong card. Your opponent will on summon be able to bring back a monster from grave. I would just Ogre this card 100% of the time, because post side they're going to be able to add the Abyss Trap. The other thing about this though is your opponent's going to be reborning, which is fine, but you want to prevent your opponent from getting the larger rank 7. The Poseidra rank 7 is actually insane, especially if your opponent's going second into you. Allowing you to just go ahead and bounce 3 cards off your opponent's board is insane. That card is very, very good. And then when it's sent to the graveyard, you can effectively soul charge. You want to make sure that you stop the Abyss Strike from being on board, because usually they'll use the effect right away. If they don't, then they just respected the Ghost Ogre and they just want to make sure that they can get out to their bigger monster. But a lot of times you will see your opponent try to reborn off this, and that's going to be your time to just go ahead and get rid of it. Now, as for White Forest, we've seen this deck start being a little bit of a problem here and there. It hasn't really done too much, but it's something that you definitely want to know what it does, because if you don't, you are going to lose to it. Impulse onto the Hollowed has been a great thing forever already, it feels like, and you want to make sure that you have Impulse. If you can play Impulse, the card's broken, it's stolen from hand, make sure you're playing this card if you can. But Impulse onto Hollowed, the Bestial hitting the Fusion in Grave, usually it'll be an Arlagames, then your opponent will use the Hollowed to shuffle back the Fusion to go ahead and get the Hollowed back in hand so they can summon out the Sylvia, which is the Omni. So before your opponent gets the chance to do so, make sure that you are going ahead and using a Bestial to just go ahead and banish the Fusion out of the grave so your opponent doesn't get that opportunity. If you have Bell, I'm probably just throwing it at the wanted poster because it's going to be in draw phase and it's going to protect you from talent, and that's just a really important thing to shut off because your opponent will end up being able to go full combo just off of having that alone. Ash Purge onto LZ, of course, the card's broken. You do want to make sure that you are drolling this deck or using like Shifter, because the new LZ is sent to the grave, I believe by a Synchro, you are allowed to go ahead and add a Sinful Spoils card. So that is even better, and that's something where you want to make sure that you are even potentially ashing that effect if they haven't used the regular LZ yet, because you want to keep your opponent off of things like the wanted poster and their other cards like Deception. But you also have cards like Ogre in the format right now, which I think is a really strong card where you can just go ahead and Ogre Deception. I don't think that's bad at all, and I think that Ogre is going to start seeing a little bit more play right now. I think that it's really strong. But Valor Imperium onto Sylvia as well is going to be a really effective way to make sure that your opponent has to have the extender. Now for the last deck here that a lot of people have seen go crazy. Fire King, we already know how to stop this deck, but I want to make sure that we get a little refresher here. Your opponent more than likely will have Sanctuary, so Ogre onto the island isn't going to be necessarily relevant, but if your opponent does just raw activate it, then you are allowed to go ahead and Ogre it, of course. Using Ash or Purge onto the Fire King Island I always think is really nice because of the fact that your opponent does need to draw a playable hand at that point, and the deck doesn't have a ton of starters. It has starters, but like, you want to make sure that you keep your opponent off of how many cards get destroyed. So definitely go ahead and just stopping that search. You can use Impulse or Bell onto the effect of Kirin when it tries to reborn itself, and I wouldn't waste it on anything else because of course the effect to reborn itself is the scariest one, so make sure that you go ahead and stop that. And then Valor Imperium on Ulcanix or Ponix, whichever one they start with, you put them on better have Kirin at that point. It's all about high rolling these days, and we are always high rolling the normal summon. I hope they enjoyed today's video. I hope that it was informative for you. Definitely let me know down below in the comment section if you enjoyed today's video, if you learned anything, and if you haven't already joined my Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, Discord, definitely go ahead and do so, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll catch you on the next video. Thank you all so much.